I am a middle-aged white woman. I'm a professor of higher education studies. I'm a mother, a grandmother, a lover, a friend, a doodler, an occasional runner, a technophile, and much more. I draw on critical and social theories to try to make sense of the world. I am skeptical of claims that suggest simple causal relationships in events in the social world, and I'm always looking to see whose interests are being served in any context. So which of these positions, and the many others that I hold, most influences my research? I suspect that they all do, though some might dominate and some might be more in the background, depending on the specific nature of the research I'm doing. In a highly raced society, I suspect that my being white, for example, may mean that some of my research participants bring assumptions about me into the room before we've even begun. On the other hand, my being raised white South African during apartheid means that I've got all sorts of barely visible privileges, and I probably have a lot of blind spots in how I view the world. So for me, positionality is about much more than my position. Perhaps aspects of my data collection might be affected by my position in the university, which is Director of Postgraduate Studies, but I think it goes far beyond that. Positionality for me is about how everything about my being affects my research, both my outer being and how I present to the world, and my inner being and how I make sense of the world. Geometa 2018 says that the words researchers use and where they are situated influence their sensibilities as investigators of the social. And the seminal article, 1988 article by Donna Haraway, argues that knowledge is always situated in a specific context. So it is not just who I am that constitutes my positionality in a study, but it's also what theoretical lenses I wear and what those lenses allow me to bring into focus and what they possibly hide from view. I see that increasingly students around the world are being asked to write positionality statements in their research proposals and in their ethical clearance applications. I mean, you can even Google ready-made positionality statements and then just insert your study details. And it worries me that increasingly we are demanding things of students that we interpret, or that the students interpret in a very technicist way. I think it's really problematic. I think thinking through my positionality entails a lot of reflexivity, in other words, reflection plus action. But given that much of my positionality emerges from my own assumptions and my own blind spots, you can't actually do this work entirely on your own. So reading texts that challenge my understandings of a phenomenon is helpful to me, and asking colleagues for feedback on my thinking is also helpful. But I think the challenge there is to try and read texts that don't have you just nodding in agreement, but actually make you feel uncomfortable or even irritated, and think through why you react in the way that you do. And when you ask colleagues for feedback, I think it's really important to include colleagues who you know have different life worlds or different views to your own. Another positionality issue that I often come up against in my own research is what Kevin Williams in his 2009 paper calls guilty knowledge. That is when you're doing insider research within your own organization, for example, and you bring all sorts of contextual understandings to the data that an outsider would not be privy to. But even those understandings will be tempered by your own views about the context. There's also an increasingly frequent discussion around positionality, which argues that only certain people have got the necessary gaze or identity to make sense of certain kinds of data, certain life experiences. In other words, only a lesbian feminist should be allowed to study lesbian feminism because only they can fully understand that experience. I think I take a bit of a middle line on this. I think if we take that to extremes, it will mean that we can only ever research ourselves, and we can only share our research with ourselves. But I also see that there are going to be very large blind spots in our understanding if our research is us researching the other. And we are trying to make sense of the other from within our own lenses. I once ran a research design workshop where a male school principal was designing narrative research on why schoolgirls fall pregnant. And I chatted to him and I got a sense of his views. But no matter how I tried, I couldn't convince him that he was not the right person to do this research. I mean, possibly with sufficient criticality and engagement with the literature, he could do the study. But I think his position, and here I mean both his position in the school, male authority figure, but also his position in terms of his belief system. He believed that these girls were wayward and that they fell pregnant without kind of no focus on anyone else who was involved. I think that meant that it was just a really bad idea for him to do that research, and I sincerely hope that the ethics committee or the higher degrees committee would have stopped it, because his own supervisor actually thought that he was very well placed to do that research. So I think reflection on your positionality can sometimes hopefully bring you to the conclusion that maybe you shouldn't be doing that research. In my own PhD, I included a personal narrative within my literature review where I looked back on and framed my own work experience alongside the literature, and looked at the very slow way in which I had become aware of my own complicity in the autonomous model that I was critiquing in my PhD. And I remember worrying at the time that it may seem a bit self-indulgent, but I think that task of confronting my positionality in my PhD study stood me in very good stead for undertaking that kind of reflection in the research that I've done since then. I don't think I've got the issue of positionality right in any of the studies I've done. I doubt I ever will, but at least I know enough to reflect as best I can on what I am doing in my research and how it is that my position positions me in that research. I hope that was helpful.